want to tell you a story about poetry in the late 20th century. So if you studied poetry at high school or in college or in graduate school in the last 50 years, you probably heard some things about what poetry has been in the late 20th century. The common account of poetry goes something like this. For thousands of years, poets wrote in lots of different forms, epics, sonnets, ballads, hymns. They mostly wrote in rhyme and meter. And then in the modernist period, this was the early 20th century, poets realized that they could be rebellious and cool, and they didn't have to play by anybody's rules. And so they changed it all, and now today you can write whatever you want. Poetry isn't about following rules or being stuffy and making rhymes. That's for kids or old people. What poetry is now is really just expressing yourself in words however you want. Are there rules? Of course not. There are no rules. To write poetry is to eternally be cool, be a rebel, be countercultural, to just express yourself and probably stick it to the man. Now, I've used language that sounds overly colloquial. And I think that's because often when we think about not just poetry, but art in general, we think of it as primarily countercultural. We've talked about this on this channel before when we've talked about why someone would want to write in formal structures. But I want to come back to this attitude toward art being self-expression and art being essentially countercultural and anti-traditional, because it really informed the poetry of the late 20th century. It informed it in a couple ways. It would be too much to go into talking about poetry as it developed in America, even just keeping ourselves to America, over the course of the 20th century. So I think it's worth picking up around the 1960s. In the 1960s, poetry in America had the examples of the previous generations, including great writers like T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Gwendolyn Brooks, people who really showed that you didn't have to write always in traditional forms to write important, powerful poetry, especially poetry that spoke of the cultural and political problems of the 20th century. And so in the 60s, you have a lot of poets who have decided, look, I have a lot of predecessors who have made great names for themselves who don't write in traditional forms. I can write free verse. My poems don't have to rhyme. My poems don't have to be metered. But my poems do have to seem to be authentic expressions of the things I most care about and I most feel, and maybe even expressions of my very idiosyncratic and individual identity. We could even, and this is where poetry in the 60s starts to be a little bit different than poetry before, we could even put our deepest, darkest kind of personal secrets and failures into the subject of our poetry. Now, it's not like poets haven't written about their deep, dark desires. Go back thousands of years and you find writers from Greece to China talking about, lost love and unrequited yearning. And yet in the 1960s, there's a group of poets that have come to be called the confessional poets. The most important of these poets are Robert Lowell and Sylvia Plath in America. And both Lowell and Plath decide very consciously that they're going to write about the things that happen in their life that in polite society would have been seen as inappropriate to talk about. They're going to write about their mental health struggles. They're going to write about their physical ailments and their hospital stays. They're going to write about those relationships in their life, not that are fulfilling and amazing, but particularly dysfunctional or particularly unsatisfying, whether with a lover, with a parent, with one's extended family. In fact, Robert Lowell in 1960 published a book of poems called Life Studies. And in Life Studies, he very intentionally starts the collection with some pretty conventional poems that wouldn't have looked out of place maybe if they were published 20 or even 40 years before. But as Life Studies goes along, he starts writing poems that are looser and looser. They use meter less and less. And they become mostly about his family, telling kind of stories of his uncle, of his father, of his mother, of himself, that would have been seen as what we might call TMI, too much information. Not that he was being horribly offensive, but that he was telling you the kind of things that families didn't talk about. By the end of the collection, he's writing about his personal struggles with mental illness. He has several lines where he talks about his mind not being right. Myself am hell, nobody's here, are two famous lines from this poem, Skunk Hour, which ends the collection. And what Lowell does at the outset of the 60s is kind of set a new standard. If you're going to write poetry, if you're going to write free verse, you got to tell us all the stuff that's inside you. Not veiled through metaphors, but just tell us. Tell us about, your crazy relative who's in prison and how you feel ashamed every time you think of them. Not often necessarily something people want to read about or people want to write about. Sylvia Plath, over the next couple of years, publishes a couple collections. The most important of these is her 1964 collection, Ariel, where she writes about her suicide attempts, where she writes about hospital stays, where she writes about how her husband cheated on her, and now she's, living with her children as a single mom, devastated by personal loss and relational trauma. She writes about hating her father. She writes about being worried that her family is complicit in anti-Semitism, and thus is maybe even in a broad sense connected to the horrors of the Holocaust. Sylvia Plath, probably even more than Robert Lowell, gives us a picture of someone who's laying it out all on the table and saying, I don't want to look good in front of you. I just want to be honest. And it's through this that I think Plath was very famous in her ability to make you feel like she was being raw and real with you, and then use that rawness and realness to provide really scathing critiques of society. She says, I think I'm going up. I think I may rise. I am a pure acetylene virgin. I'm not entirely sure all of what that means, but there's this sense of the immolated self, the self on fire, that's raised up for all to see. Not because the self is, so perfect and so conforming to everyone's wishes, and not because the self is very rich and famous and powerful, but because the self is telling the truth about its own trauma, about what society has done to her, about what men have done to her. And she is kind of embodying all women in her fury and in her glory. Does it make you want to read Sylvia Plath to hear that? It makes me want to read Sylvia Plath. But one of the things that Plath and Lowell created was this image that the poet is this sort of self on fire who burns their secrets and their family dysfunction away in front of us on the page. And that if you want to be a poet, you got to be troubled. If you want to be a poet, you got to be angry. If you want to be a poet, it's not just that you can't conform to society in your life, that any sort of conforming to tradition or societal expectations, or, God forbid, some far, classical past, is a betrayal of art itself, is a betrayal of poetry itself. Sylvia Plath may have written sonnets in her spare time, but she gives us no traditionally rhymed sonnets. She does have some lines that rhyme here and there, and she does have some gestures toward pentameter here and there. I am a riddle in 9 syllables is a nice, nearly pentameter line that she starts one of her poems with. And yet Plath and Lowell beside her are really trying to shake off the last vestiges of traditional form, even as they create this new vision of the poet. Both die young. Plath dies by her own hand. And there were other poets who had similar trajectories. Anne Sexton, who was a friend of Plath's, who also dies by her own hand, who also writes very intense free verse poems about her mental illness and her trauma. Very powerful poems. But this created, in the expectations of the reading public, a feeling for what poetry should be. And if you can write poetry, that means you must have a life like Plath's, or like Lowell's, or like Sexton's. And if you don't have a life like them, can you really write poetry? What if you were normal? What if you were just a normal, average Jane or Joe who wanted to write a haiku or a sonnet or a description of a bird in flight because you thought it was beautiful and you wanted to give a picture of it in words that did honor to what you experienced? Could you write that, or would that be somehow lesser, somehow not as important, or maybe even an insult to the deep, tragic monstrosity and vigor of the confessional poet's work? Well, a group of poets in the 1980s started feeling that this was true. There's a lot of poets in this group. The couple I'd point to who are worth checking out include Gertrude Schnackenberg, Dana Gioia, Marilyn Hacker, Marilyn Nelson, Jane Greer, and a few others. And they decided to get back into writing poems in form. Now, these are interesting people. These are people with something to say. These aren't people who want to be dreary and boring. But these are people who didn't really buy Plath and Lowell as the only type of poets and only type of poetic lives one can live. Lowell got a lot of flack in the 1970s for publishing love letters from his mistress in a collection of poetry to his mistress, even as he was going through a messy, controversial divorce. Apparently, another poet told him, poetry isn't worth ruining your life over. But Lowell thought it was important that you knew all the details of his sordid love affairs. And that was the content of his poetry. Poets like Dana Gioia, poets like Jane Greer, poets like Gertrude Schnackenberg said, you know what, no. Like, one, I don't want to live a messed up life like that. And two, I don't feel like I need to give it to you to read about. Gertrude Schnackenberg has a wonderful poem called Supernatural Love, which is a poem in rhyming tercets that tells a story of learning the origin of the word carnation from her grandfather when she was a little girl. Very different than things that Plath or Lowell would write about. And yet, still poetry. Dana Gioia has a long poem that's a narrative about a man robbing a house and the moral implications of robbing a house. It's not him robbing a house. It's not somebody that robbed his house. He wanted to get into the mind of the robber. These poets who return to form are called the New Formalists. And by the 1990s, there was a really strong movement toward New Formalism that even looked back in the 1960s and said, you know, people like Plath and Lowell, they're not the only people writing. What about somebody like Richard Wilbur, who was a World War II vet, who wrote formal poems, sonnets, ballads. He has a wonderful ballad about a vampire, all in rhyming verse. Wilbur was so prolific, he even translated a bunch of Molière, who wrote in rhyming French. He wrote whole plays that rhymed, every line of them in French, and he translated them into rhyming formal English plays. What if we champion people like Wilbur, champion people like Gwendolyn Brooks, who did often write in rhyme and meter? What if we look at the elements of T.S. Eliot even, where he is employing traditional form? What if we question this idea that 20th century poetry has been one slow slide into rebellion and free verse, forever eschewing the traditional forms of the past? What if we interpret the 20th century as having a continuous formalist tradition? And by the late 90s, that became a real possibility. And we had kind of two streams. We had a establishment free verse that just unquestioningly followed free verse. And we had a group of formalists who saw themselves as rebels. We want to look at some of these new formalists in future videos and continue to think about these different strains of poetry, these different pictures of what a poet is and what poetry is about. Thanks for hanging out with us in this historical overview. We'll keep talking about these things, asking these questions about this weird thing, poetry, which can be so wild and free and so detailed and constrained and everywhere in between. Thanks so much.